Before the first musket was fired at Lexington, the real conflict was already underway. A fight over the meaning of freedom in a world built on slavery. Across the British Atlantic, politicians and revolutionaries wielded slavery and liberty like weapons, twisting moral language to claim virtue while defending power. The result was a political landscape riddled with contradictions, one where the pursuit of the moral high ground ran straight through the institutions of human bondage. This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am your host, Isaac S. Loftus, joined, as always, by my knowledgeable co-host, Dr. Lynn Robbins.
Hey, everyone.
And we come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And today, we have a particularly nuanced subject to talk about.
Yes, we are very excited to welcome Dr. Matthew Mason. He's a professor of history at Brigham Young University, and we're excited to talk about his new book, Seeking the High Ground, Slavery and Political Conflict in the British Atlantic World. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
So, Dr. Mason, I wanted to start today by reading a quote, and one that particularly confuses me as I got into studying history. It wasn't something that I was aware of when I was in school, but as I got more into working in the history space and started reading more of the words of the founders, there was something that read very strangely to me. So I'm going to read a quote from Patrick Henry, and some readers might recognize a section of it, but it's not often quoted in its full context. So it starts thus. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Now, people might recognize the very end of that because it's pretty famous. But the allusion to the idea that the American colonies were somehow enslaved by their relationship with England feels like a very strange choice of words to my ears. Like it, from my modern perspective, it is so bizarre to me that a guy could stand up there with his full chest and say, we cannot stand to be slaves, while behind him is legitimately, literally like an enslaved person. Not saying that that's what happened in the speech, but metaphorically speaking, that it did it not. I'm hoping we can make some sense of this duality, because when I'm reading it, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Like, do they not? It reads like an SNL sketch,
right?
Right? Like that's how ridiculous this whole thing seems.
Right.
Am I? Is that unwarranted? Is my perspective is like
no.
that strange or?
That is the natural reaction to roll your eyes back behind your skull or however far back they can roll. Come on, man. You really want to talk about enslavement. And of course, that's many British critics of the American patriots and British loyalists and American loyalists. Response is, I think you're abusing the word slavery there, pal. But part of why he would have said that is that it was such a natural analogy because he lived in a slave society, because slavery was not an abstraction to someone like Patrick Henry. They knew the risks of what it meant to be enslaved. And so one of the things I write about in this book is one of the functions of rhetoric like that makes us and many of their opponents, all of their opponents at the time, roll their eyes, is that it showed that Patrick Henry was taking this stuff seriously, that he understood the gravity of the threat that the British policies on taxation and so forth posed. It was I write about it as sort of like a shibboleth amongst patriots. It showed that you were part of the group. You understood how serious this stuff was. And anyone who resisted resorting to that sort of analogy they just don't get it. They're not awake to the dangers of the British policies.
Okay, so the juxtaposition is intentional as opposed to sort of accidental, or because I think that there's a wide sort of a common way to kind of parse over the founders and the relationship between the founders and slavery to be like, it was part of their time. Like all this is like, they didn't understand. They didn't, this, but it's, what you're saying is that he must have understood because that was the point. Right.
Yeah. And they were men of their times thing. Um, if I had more hair left, I would tear it out every time I carve it out. Every time I
Right?
heard that kind of phrasing, because a big part of what I'm trying to argue, and I'm certainly not alone in this, is that in their time, slavery was hotly contested. It's not
Mm,
the idea that they were men of their times, and so therefore they were X, simplifies the degree to which everything was contested in relation to slavery, and people were therefore very alert to the complexity of using a metaphor like that. And I mean, one of my favorite quotes that illustrates this is from George Washington, who was trying to get one of his friends, a fellow Virginia planter, to pay attention to this stuff. This is really serious. And he argued, and I think it was in 1774, that if the British measures, like the coercive acts and all these taxation measures, succeeded, we will be as tame and abject slaves as the Negroes we rule over with such arbitrary sway. So he understood the connection that he was making, and he understood that he lived in a slave society, and he was very far from alone. And then, of course, then the question is, what are you going to do about that kind of potential disconnect? And I felt like I needed a couple hundred pages to explore that kind of stuff.
Well,
yeah.
and I mean, even just the title of your book emphasizes that because it's called Seeking the High Ground. And what you talk about is that slavery, rhetorical, sort of political slavery is you call it, if you could explain what that is. But they're seeking the high ground, not by embracing slavery, but by trying to say they're not at fault or the other side is worse. So
Right.
can you explain sort of, you say, seeking the high ground. So clearly they know it's wrong. Perhaps they're,
Mhm.
are they talking about the political slavery? Are they talking about the chattel slavery? So tell us a little bit about the title of your book and how you got to that.
Yeah, happy to. So, one of the things I noticed, what I was trying to do is take these patriots and loyalists on both sides of the debate seriously, in terms of not just at face value, but take them seriously for what they said was at stake in this conflict. And what they said at great length in every potential media was that the kind of highest ideals of the British Atlantic world in this kind of age of enlightenment and religious awakening were at stake in this conflict. And one of the things that struck me is how existential everybody believed this conflict was. And so, therefore, your side had to constantly occupy the moral slash political high ground when it came to the values that their generation held dear. And among those values was freedom, but also being a consistent lover of liberty. And so that, along with other ideals that I identify in this book, uh, gave it made it so that slavery was naturally connected to that. Sometimes people write, and sometimes I've been a little guilty of this in the past, because I've always been interested in what I call the politics of slavery,
Mhm.
which has to do with not just when people were directly talking about slavery, but when they were debating something else, and slavery becomes a weapon in that debate. And
Mm.
so it's both debating slavery and using slavery in some other debate is what I mean by the politics of slavery. And I think I confessed earlier in my career I was more likely to write about these as issues that seemed to be totally unrelated to slavery. Like I began my career like researching the War of 1812. Like, what does this debate over funding the troops during the War of 1812 have anything to do with slavery? And so see, that's the way I tended to describe it. But especially doing this research for this book, I changed my mind and realized this was the most natural connection they could have made because of the importance of slavery in their world and because it constituted the low ground. If
Right.
freedom constitutes the high ground and all the other kind of ideals that I write about, then slavery is the natural binary of that.
And what's really interesting to me is because you cite a lot of books that I've read and read in grad school and since then, and you're sort of pushing against a bit of the narrative that we've had about it being, I'll say, less complicated. That it was sort of, everyone either approved of slavery. It was the revolution was all the colonists got together, all the white colonists got together. They were all on the same side. They were all, let's go ahead and get rid of England. And what I love about your book is that you're making it more complicated. You're saying it wasn't just these monolith groups of people who had these same visions. And this is about everything, but of course, slavery as the most important.
Right. I mean, it's almost like I think someone should create a podcast like Too Complicated for History or something like that. 'Cause, I mean, that's my jam, right? That's what I'm trying to communicate here. We're in this kind of interesting moment amongst debates amongst historians, and that has actually gone out into the broader public in recent years about the relationship between slavery and the American Revolution, both in terms of the causes and the consequences of the American Revolution. And it has become extraordinarily polarized to where you have historians, and then if you're looking at the kind of broader political culture, the 1619 Project from the New York Times channeled this idea that in terms of the causes, what united patriots was the defense of white supremacy and slavery. And therefore, unsurprisingly, the most notable consequences of the American Revolution were pro-slavery and pro-white supremacy. And it does tend to be kind of, in the way you were describing, Lynn, sort of a unitary reading of, that Americans or white Americans believed X. And it becomes sort of a totalizing unitary kind of interpretation. And then in reaction to that, you get people, both historians and people out in the broader public, saying essentially, shut up. It's not that about all that stuff. The causes of the American Revolution were all the things you were taught in school about the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and its taxation and representation and liberty, people, that caused the American Revolution. And when you look at the consequences, the most notable consequence was the rise of anti-slavery. And so you get both amongst historians and the broader public kind of shut up with that pro-slavery narrative. We've got the narrative, but they both tend to be very unitary in the ways that you were describing. And I'm coming through trying to make enemies, I guess, or friends on both sides, saying, people, it's way more complicated than that. People within these movements and thereafter were divided about the best way to approach slavery and the consequences of using the rhetoric we've been talking about for actual slavery, and on and on. When I set out to write this book, I thought I'd do maybe a chapter on the colonial period and 2 chapters on the American Revolutionary era, the imperial crisis, and then the war. And no, there was so much material, and it was so complicated from so many different angles that the one from the colonial period became 2 chapters, and the 2 became 5 from the American Revolutionary era, precisely because of the complexity of what's going on, both in terms of causes and consequences.
And I'll just say, I think that is a perfect illustration of history in general, that if something seems simple, it's probably being oversimplified.
You're leaving something out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You can't get 10 people in a room together today and to agree on anything. I can't imagine that people think that that's how history was. Like, everyone in the country was all singing the same song.
Right. And this goes to broader claims for the founding fathers. And when people are looking for like original intent on this or that thing amongst the founding fathers, they would be horrified to be reduced to a group, because this is one of the most quarrelsome generations in ever, and certainly American history. I mean, this is why it's such a rich documentary record, as they endlessly argued over the nuances of this or that and wrote it all down for us.
Yeah, I think there was in the intro, I think weirdly I have it on my desk because I was just reading a chapter from it, but in one of Nathaniel Philbrick's books, he talks about how the guy who was like the secretary of the Constitutional Convention planned to write a book about it later. And then by the time he got around to it, like 20 years later, he was like, you know what, I'm not going to spoil the story they're telling each themselves. Like, it was that quick that it became mythologized and sort of stuff started getting papered over. It was within a generation. Right. So it's not like something that we're doing or we did. This has
Right.
just been happening,
Right.
right, over and over again. Things have been smoothed over, corners been buffed out of that story. So I will say, to put a fig leaf out, like, it's no one's fault. It's not your fault if you believe one of these things versus the other.
Right.
It's just something that's been happening.
Right.
That's just what you've been hearing. But it's great that you are coming in with the intent of sort of cutting through all of that stuff and revealing the cracks underneath.
Right. I do
That
think it
story.
is sort of a human trait, and certainly an American trait, to want kind of almost kind of pantomime narratives of heroes and villains. And I mean, one of the things I tell my students all the time is that kind of academic historians like me are usually the last people you want at your rally, because
That's true.
political activism is fueled by these kind of unitary narratives and kind of melodrama, and we'll come in at your rally and take the mic and say it was more complicated than that, and then all the air will go out of the whole situation. But that is
We'll
kind of
provide
what
context. Yeah.
we do.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard a chant at a march that was, well, actually,
Right.
well, actually.
This
If
statue is
you
more
if
complicated than it seems. It's not
if
gonna
you
work.
read the sources,
Yeah.
if you read the sources, you're like, yeah, never heard those chants.
Right.
But that's in as far as the figures that are participating in this kind of rhetoric, I'm really curious. Was there any acknowledgement of the inherent hypocrisy of what they were talking about, like when they were, because obviously they were getting some flack from the outside, or were they saying that, like, that's just a spin by our opponents, or was there an internal acknowledgement of, like, that, hey, I'm hearing this?
Yeah. I'm gonna kind of. I hope you're sitting down. I'm gonna tell you it was complicated. Because yes, I mean, one of the most famous quotes from this era is Samuel Johnson beating up on these guys. How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negro slaves, right? And so I
Yeah.
expected that when I did this research, is opponents calling the others hypocrites. I mean, that's the low hanging fruit of this entire debate. One thing that struck me is how often they even though it was low hanging and it seemed like an obvious point, they never tired of saying it. But on the other hand, another thing that surprised me more was the degree to which, let's say, within the patriot movement, there is an enormous amount of kind of self scrutiny and insecurity that maybe we are hypocrites. I mean, there are true believers who are just going to double down and say, shut up. There's no, you all are the ones who are sustaining slavery in all its manifestations. But there was kind of not insignificant number, and a surprising number to me, of patriots, and kind of a movement within the patriot political culture of kind of introspection, like, well, could it be that we're hypocrites when it comes to chattel slavery? I mean, they were what held them together was their opposition to what they perceived as political slavery. But then they were divided amongst themselves about what that meant for chattel slavery. And a large number of them argued, you know what? We need to, if we really want to be consistent lovers of liberty, we need to act like consistent lovers of liberty. And this, to me, is one example of how that debate had an anti-slavery impact on many patriots. Certainly not all, but it did lead them to reflect. And people who were abolitionists leveraged that all the time because they knew how kind of hypersensitive patriots were to this charge of hypocrisy, and it worked really well for their purposes.
And what?
Could,
Oh,
oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Lynn, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Isaac.
I was just going to ask for a point of clarification for our listeners, and we've covered this, I think, once or twice before. But could you sort of define what the anti-slavery movement of the 18th century is in comparison, sort of like, because I think what people are very familiar with is the abolition movement of the 19th century, right? And they're very different things.
Yeah, that's a big part of what I'm trying to do in some of the early chapters of this book. So I'll try to condense an answer. Because one thing that's going on from the moment of the English, and then the British Empire, is a lot of anti-slavery rhetoric uh, from the metropole, but also out in the colonies, to essentially ask, what are they doing? over there with all of the, not only slavery, but white servitude
Hmm.
of Englishmen and Irishmen and Scottish people and so forth. Uh, and historians have traditionally written about that kind of chorus of objection to the unfreedom that they perceived out in this supposedly free Protestant English and then British Empire as isolated voices in the wilderness, certainly not organized the way the better known abolitionist movement is in the 19th century. And then some of the most insistent voices are Quakers, members of the Society
Mm.
of Friends, who, for deeply held religious reasons, critique slavery, and they also are dismissed as sort of naive idealists, also crying in the wilderness. And a lot of the research that I did in conjunction, and I've learned a lot from especially Quaker historians, showed me that okay, if politics looks like organized and abolitionism looks like organized effort against slavery that then produces a reaction amongst enslavers, that really that describes the kind of political sophistication and impact of people like the Quakers and other almost entirely deeply religious critics of
Hmm.
slavery in the throughout the colonial period, but picking up momentum in the middle of the 18th century. And so I actually kind of had the sort of uncomfortable at first experience of having to revise myself because in my first book 19 years ago, I came right out, I think, in the opening line of the first chapter and said, the politics of slavery began in earnest with the American Revolution, and then went on to talk about how the American Revolution put that on the agenda. But I was convinced by so many scholars, especially of the Quakers' anti-slavery activism, that what they were doing looks a lot like politics and certainly had a political impact on the
Hmm.
enslavers. All that said, other than Quakers, you don't have organized networks of abolitionists until the age of the American Revolution. So there are some really important shifts in the age of the American Revolution, but it is an overstatement to say there was no abolitionism before the American Revolution. I hope that's kind of what you were asking about.
Yeah, yeah. Because slavery looked very different in the 18th century versus the 19th century, and so did the movements that were pushing back against it.
Right. That
Absolutely.
I my friend and often collaborator David Waldstreicher, he gave some important lectures, the first Benjamin Franklin lectures at the McNeil Center for Early American
Hmm.
Studies in Philadelphia last year, and he posited this really, I think, promising interpretation along the lines of what you were saying, Isaac, in some of these lectures, is that with every change to slavery as it was practiced throughout the Atlantic world, abolitionists changed, and
Hmm.
kind of slavery kept getting worse. If you can imagine something that was already rubbish getting more rubbish, and anti-slavery activists adjusted accordingly. I think that's a promising way to look at it. That explains some continuities as well as changes within anti-slavery work.
That kind of leads to my question that is so important. I think when in grade school and maybe even 10 years ago, we always looked at the revolution as in the North American colonies. And then we started adding in maybe, let's add in some West Indies. And then we started looking at what was going on in England, in Britain at the time. And you talk about that, not only the ideas of anti-slavery and political slavery in the colonies, but also over in England, and how they're also sort of battling each other to say who has the high ground, that it wasn't just happening in the colonies. And I thought that was really interesting because it seems like the Atlantic world and also global view really does change the way we look at slavery and the revolution.
I agree. I appreciate you highlighting that kind of element of what I'm trying to do. I mean, some of the most revealing research for me was the multiple and very complicated ways in which the British opponents of the war and of the government, the North government, Lord North was the prime minister during this, during the war, leveraged slavery and freedom and sought to kind of gain the high ground on all the different kind of ideals that they treasured within British Atlantic culture and within British culture, back home. And, the kind of sheer volume, but also complexity of the political work and rhetorical appeals that British opponents to the war made really struck me as part of this research.
Mm.
And I obviously agree with you that a transatlantic viewpoint on the American Revolution is a helpful one. And one of the things I note about the debates amongst historians and the general public that I noted earlier
Mhm.
is they tend to be very insular to the United States and the impact of the American Revolution and the causes of the American Revolution within the United States. And part of the complexity of the impact of the American Revolution is that it had a massive and as yet indeterminate in the short term impact on the remaining British Empire.
Mm.
So, yeah, it's all complicated. It makes it even more complicated to expand the kind of lens.
Right.
Yeah, Americans having an American-centric view of history. What
Yeah,
are
shocking.
you talking about? I've
Yeah.
never heard of such a thing.
Breaking news.
This might be a difficult question to get into, but I'm curious as to, so in seeking the high ground, why why did it matter who had like sort of the moral, edge on the other opponent? Were there people to sway? Was there public opinion? Did all that matter? Like, what is the context of this debate that is actually taking place, and
Yeah,
why was it important?
that's a great question, because some historians argue that that rhetoric is just that. It's kind of window dressing, and it doesn't really
Mhm.
move people. And some, especially but not only military historians, write as if the only thing that was going on was a war. Um,
Mm.
but I posit that the war was a war not only of guns and cannon, but also of propaganda and political rhetoric. And that political rhetoric had two people hoped when they were jockeying for the high ground that it would have two impacts. One was to hold your own movement together, to reassure, especially the Patriots, because they didn't have the military momentum for much of this struggle, and the odds were against
Sure.
them, and so forth. To kind of hold cohesion as a group was really important, and reassuring each other that our cause, as my opening quote, I quote a evangelical preacher saying that the American cause is the cause of God. Uh,
Mhm.
Mm.
Kind of helps with sustaining morale throughout the conflict. But then, yeah, I think it's helpful to think about the American Revolutionary era, just like other eras of polarization, as a three cornered conflict between extremists, true believers, and people who were persuadable within the broad middle. And a lot of people who write about those persuadable people pay a lot of attention to like whose army is marching through their neighborhood. That ends up being very
Right.
persuasive. But I also believe that this war of pamphlets and newspaper essays could also, and was certainly written in the hope of persuading the persuadable.
Yeah, because I think that question came from the thought in my head of like, I understand why public sentiment is important in a democracy,
Right.
but in an undemocratic society, I was like, okay, what does it matter?
Right.
But I guess where the rubber meets the road, because they are literally quartering soldiers in people's houses and stuff like that, and I think it makes much more sense in that context.
Yeah. It's a great question. I hope that makes sense as an answer.
Yeah, for sure.
And as long as we're talking about definitions, one thing I found is that sometimes we don't distinguish between the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War. And I
Right.
think with the American Revolution, we're starting at the 65, Stamp Act to the Constitution. That's what you're looking at versus just
Mm.
the 8 years of the military battle, which
Right.
I
And
think
I
is
and
really
I,
important.
I appreciate that, because certain things within even the rhetoric changed drastically with the advent of war. So I'll take two examples. One, I have a whole chapter on the broad ideal of humanity, which we might kind of call humanitarianism, but it also relates to kind of ideas of the laws of war and civilization, as they would have described it. And of course, both sides were eager to deny that up to the other before the war. But with the advent of war, that becomes way more pressing because you have actual atrocities to react to and to publicize, to deny your enemy of the high ground. And so that related to things like prisoners of war and the ongoing battle to enlist indigenous people as allies. That was the British were more successful in because that connected to questions of civilization and morality and humanity and so forth. But so did slavery. Uh, whereas on the one hand, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, offering freedom to American slaves beginning in Virginia, you'd think would have won the humanity battle for the British. Look, we are the liberators. But the Patriots, not willing to give an inch on the moral high ground, argued that's a war crime. And that is itself encouraging rebellion. You call us rebels. You're trying to stir up the worst form of rebellion. And so the war changed the kind of urgency of questions of humanity. I have another chapter on honor, which was always important to people up and down, especially at the top of the social scale in the British Atlantic world. But it's also a military value. And so it takes on new valences and urgency during the war that I found had really kind of surprising impacts. It's not none of the, which is to say the imperial crisis period was not not significant. It certainly shaped a huge number of these arguments, but the war, especially in those two chapters, played a really important kind of turning point role in my narrative.
Yeah, sorry. The idea that there was an argument that the Dunmore Proclamation was a war crime. I was like, I think I know how that would be argued, and it makes me a little bit nauseous.
Right.
Like try to try to like put those
Mm-hmm.
things in words, but like there you go with the same. That's that contradiction that we're talking about.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and to me, that's the most kind of, as much as I argue to the side that says this is a pro-slavery revolution, cohering around white supremacy is more complicated than that. The Patriots' reaction, not only amongst Southern white patriots to Lord Dunmore's proclamation, is the strongest evidence of the kind of white supremacist reading of his proclamation, because it denies the very idea of his proclamation being liberatory. Is that a word? Sure. Liberate.
It sounds like it.
Yeah,
Now it
liberatory.
is.
What's wrong with
Yeah.
that? Precisely along racial lines and along the lines of maintaining order in a slave society.
Yeah, and personal property rights and kind of private property rights and all that kind of
Yeah, and
stuff.
also this long-running
yeah.
fear of for your life in a slave society with all the dystopian violence that slavery is. It's a long-running fear of, especially enslavers, but not only enslavers in this in these societies, that slave revolt is their worst nightmare, and that's what they see when they read Lord Dunmore's proclamation.
Yeah, I guess it's hard. It's almost like this is a strange analogy, but I think we've had some discussions about religion in the era, and I was saying it's really hard to like parse out the religiosity of the founders because Christianity was so interwoven with
Right.
society, like everything that took place. So you can't really disentangle it from anything to sort of give it like analyze anything without it,
Right.
because just the worldview was so defined by that, and it almost seems as if the argument that this is driven by white supremacy is hard to make when has a similar integration into all of society.
Right.
Right? It can't be about that because that's so ubiquitous. That wasn't even part of the question.
Right.
Like
Right.
it's about other stuff, but that was present, but not part of the debate necessarily.
Right. One of the kind of propositions of the pro-slavery reading of the American Revolution is that somehow the British were an actual threat to slavery and white supremacy, as if they were an abolitionist empire in the 1780s in the way that they would become in the 1830s.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very different empire. As many patriots pointed out, have you forgotten about the West Indies? What are you doing running around freeing American slaves? You are not abolitionists. Have you? Uh, what would you do if this happened in the West Indies and so forth? So there are certain things that are not on the table here,
Yeah.
in ways that you were describing, including that the British themselves partook in the broader white supremacy and support of slavery, except when it made tactical and propaganda sense to seize the anti-slavery high ground.
Yeah, it's very interesting that the Dunmore Proclamation brought about a fear that the enslaved population was going to do exactly what the colonists were doing with England, but they were going to do it with
Right,
the colonists.
right.
There's so
Yeah,
much of that in history.
yeah. Another kind of surprising little theme that I found super interesting to learn about is kind of the politics of rebellion. Who are actual rebels in this situation?
Mm,
Because because of course the British resort to calling these folks rebels, traitors, against the British crown. And you might think that, okay, end of discussion. But this is especially where the British opponents of the Lord North's administration and his policies come in very strongly, as they say, no, you in the government are the rebels against the true meaning of the British Constitution, and the ideals and limits on power that make up the
Hmm.
British Constitution. So you are the true rebels against all that is holy, and the Americans are kind of trying to preserve the best parts of the British Constitution. And then when Lord Dunmore, in November of 1775, seems to many readers to be encouraging, although that's not the plain meaning of the text, by arming freedom seekers, seems to be encouraging slave revolt and actually organizing slave revolt. Then patriots and the British allies can seize on, aha, not only are you rebels against all that is holy, you are arming rebels. That's on brand for
Hmm.
you.
right.
And so the
Sure.
kind of the politics of who is the rebel and who is the traitor were fascinatingly complicated and revealing, I think.
Yeah. I mean, those terms are a matter of perspective.
Right.
Pretty much always. Like,
Hmm.
one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even in
What do
today's
you even call
conversations.
what happened on January 6th has been
Right.
a matter of some
Yeah.
debate.
Yeah, and probably won't be settled in some for many
Right.
decades, if it ever is, in history books at some point. Um, but yeah, we had a previous episode this season about uh, I think I'm forgetting his first name, Jean Jacques Dessalines. Is that
Hmm.
am I correctly? Jean
That's
Jacques,
right.
yeah, yeah, and like he was, vilified and demonized, really, but integral into the successful revolution of the Haitian people. So,
Right,
um, but from a French perspective, that guy was a straight up terrorist
Right.
right,
and a murderer and a
right.
mass murderer. But yeah, that's really interesting in that the perspective of the patriots and sort of it's very Jeffersonian in that the hey it reminds me of Jefferson saying, hey, we should be able to rewrite the government or overthrow tyrannical governments, because that's kind of like how they saw themselves and what they were doing.
Right.
You
Right.
guys have betrayed the core tenets of this and
Yeah,
moved
and
forward.
coming back to your earlier theme about religion, which shows up all over my narrative. Uh,
Mm.
Hmm.
One of the flags I show my students from the American Revolution, they love their flags. They were Sheldon Cooper having fun with flags all the time. In early American history, was it emblazoned with the motto, "Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God," and that's a way to flip
Hmm.
the idea that they were themselves rebels and traitors and so forth.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. It would be really hard for them, for North American Anglicans, to because I mean the king's the head of the church, right? Like it's
Right,
you're literally revolting against the hierarchy of
Hmm.
your
right.
faith in this. So it's probably was important for them to thing. Would you say that this is a very silly question, but would you say that flags were the 18th century memes?
Yeah, I
Like
think
this were
so.
the
They got really
yeah.
creative with these. They brought it with the flags.
Yeah, everyone changed their profile picture to the the "Don't tread on me" the Gadsden flag
Right,
or something
Yes.
like that. That's what it would be today, right?
That's
Everyone's
yep.
putting up a
right. Or the Ukrainian flag everyone put on their Facebook.
yeah,
That was
exactly.
great.
Hmm.
Yeah, So maybe
Yeah,
flags are the
yeah,
memes of today, like they were the memes of the, yeah,
Or maybe
yeah. It could be.
memes today are the flags of the revolutionary period
yeah.
since they came first.
Yeah. So it's this. There's so much. I'm curious to know. Is there any particularly in your research? Was there any particular figure from this that had a unique perspective that surprised you in this? You know, any of these founding fathers, quote unquote, that you went through, and you're like, oh, I didn't expect that.
Right.
You know, given your
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. As my mind spins, one figure is my boy Benjamin Rush. Uh,
oh,
he
okay,
was a super interesting dude. He starts with being pretty standard American patriot in that he was studying medicine in Edinburgh at the beginning of the imperial crisis. And there's this wonderful dramatic moment where, while he's over there in the midst of the imperial crisis, touring Parliament, like I've taken my students to do, and as part of the tour, they pause uh, and point to the kind of the royal throne in the tour, and he's swept up with these emotions of British patriotic zeal, his great reverence for the crown at that moment in his life. But then when they go over to the House of Commons, he almost doesn't even want to walk in there, because that, he says in his diary, is where they hatched the scheme to enslave America. So he starts out as a pretty straightforward, orthodox, and by saying stuff like that, showing that he was an orthodox patriot.
yeah.
And he's one of these that over time I find to be super interesting, because he's one of the more introspective patriots. As you move later in his patriot career, he really is kind of anguished over questions of consistency, and whether and he becomes a strong anti-slavery activist there within Philadelphia, and helps with the founding of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and so forth. And so he comes to this watching him change from a pretty straightforward employer of the slave metaphor while he's touring Parliament to kind of becoming more thoughtful about these things, and that launches him into anti-slavery activism. I found that the trajectories like that, and especially in transatlantic sense of things, the degree to which he was corresponding with British abolitionists like Granville Sharp and other friends across the Atlantic who were themselves patriots and anti-slavery, helped him kind of move to combine those two in ways that I thought was really revealing about one branch of the impact of the American Revolution on someone like that.
It's not surprising that intrigued you, and interestingly enough, in your own scholarly journey, having sort of reworked your
Right,
previous perspective, right? That
right,
someone that it's not surprising that you said, "Hey, pick somebody that evolved over time."
right.
Yeah, that's neat. And I commend you for doing that, because there's not a lot of scholars that do. A lot of people double down. I'm
Yeah.
going to I'm basically write another book about the same thing again to further make my case. It takes another level of introspection and inquiry to rewrite your previous perspective,
Mm.
essentially.
I appreciate that. I mean,
That's very
that's
cool.
some of my historian heroes have shown. An example that springs to mind is Charles Dew, a historian of the antebellum South, who wrote this fantastic book that I and so many other people use in teaching the Civil War era, Apostles of Disunion,
Hmm.
about Southern secession commissioners trying to preach the gospel of secession in the secession winter. And in his preface to that book, he talks about how he grew up with a lost cause narrative as a white Virginian growing up in the middle of the 20th century. And then he read the sources and came to a very different conclusion about the causes of the American Civil War. Part of why I assigned that is it shows a historian kind of in the preface working through how he changed his mind as a result of just doing further research. And that's what happened to me, is like I'm making these sweeping statements in 2016 about the pre-revolutionary era with only having done some of the research necessary to make a statement like that. So I think I've learned from people that I admire as historians that you gotta be willing to change your mind. And
Absolutely.
conversations with people like the preeminently David Wallstreicher and I began our relationship with kind of pretty significant differences of interpretation over matters that we think are really important. That most
Mhm.
people would say, "Really, you're arguing over that?" But to us, these were deeply held, positions. But that has launched actually collaboration, multiple collaborations, including on the very issue about the political impact of the Somerset decision in 1772 that we started disagreeing with probably 15 years ago. And so being able to collaborate with people that you disagree with without killing each other is a high ideal. Me trying to seek the high ground as a historian, but so is like changing your mind as to the degree necessary in response to further research and conversations with persuasive people.
Right. We should almost teach history as it's good to have educated conversations, or say conversations based in the sources. I mean, once you start, once it gets into how you feel about things, not so much, but
Right.
we shouldn't all agree on history because that's saying there's only one perspective. So I
Right.
think that should be more encouraged in
Listen, Lynn,
general.
for me, this conversation makes me feel bad about being an
Good.
American.
That
For
was
me,
that was
for
my goal.
me.
That's usually my
and,
goal,
and
Isaac.
that's the most important
For
thing that we're
that's
talking about
yeah.
is
It's
my feelings for me.
I wake up every morning and say, "How can I make Isaac feel bad?" So I'm glad that today has been a successful day thus far.
I'm only
Um,
kidding, audience.
I'm
Do you
not.
listening? You can't see me smiling in the video for audience only listeners.
So I want to make sure we talk about the global reputation of the colonies in the new U.S.
Right.
Just like today, we think, what do the other countries think of us? Part of this would be the use of political slavery and chattel slavery, and them trying to, colonists are trying to either argue or rectify that there are two different outcomes for those two things, or they're two different things. And then how is the world looking, not just England, but how is the world looking on the colonies and saying, are they saying, look at these spoiled brats who are trying to say this is, this kind of slavery is different from this? Or do you get more who are saying this is great? I mean, obviously the French had a reaction to the
Yeah.
American Revolution, but how did it change the reputation?
That's a great question. It was a part of the research I didn't expect to do because I was very focused on Anglo-American relationship. That's what this broad project is the Anglo-American relationship across a broad period of time. And but yeah, the sources led me to especially European liberals or reformers who, in broad terms, before the era of the American Revolution, had kind of looked to Britain with its mixed constitution and kind of sense of rule of law as certainly a better model than kind of absolutist or would be absolutist regimes on the continent of Europe. And so the British were in the vanguard. Too many kind of philosophes of the Enlightenment and kind of European reformers were in the vanguard of kind of human liberty and um, ordered rational liberty because of its mixed constitution and so forth. But many of them I found changing horses in the American Revolution. Like, what are the British doing? Oppressing these upstart Americans. These upstart Americans are in the vanguard of human liberty, and we're going to cheer these people on. And the diplomacy, cultural and otherwise, of Ben Franklin running around in Paris wearing a coonskin cap for the first time in his life because that's what they want out of an American. So sure, I'll wear coonskin cap and be like a settler of the forest or whatever these philosophes want me to be. Had its impact. But then one thing that struck me is that then this kind of broad support for the American revolutionaries amongst European liberal reformers and some radical reformers um, had a predictable impact on American patriots. Uh, like, yeah, we are awesome. Uh, you're gonna provide that Kool-Aid, we'll drink it. We are the most awesome people who have ever been awesome. And in some Americans, certainly not all, but some American patriots, that nurtured a sense of kind of complacency. Like, why would around things like slavery, like, we are the bastion of liberty, full stop. All we have to do is defend that. We don't need to reform it ourselves. So it kind of created, can you form a blind spot by drinking Kool-Aid, or am I mixing? I'll go with, they drank the Kool-Aid and that created some blind spot towards actual abuses in American society, like
Right.
slavery, for some people who drank that Kool-Aid.
They're believing their own rhetoric or
Right.
their own
And the press they were
cheerleaders.
getting from people that they valued deeply, these European leading thinkers and political activists.
Yeah, it's
Right.
one thing to perpetuate your own myth, but it's another thing to start believing it yourself.
Right.
Right.
Believing your own press. But yeah, I mean, think about
Yeah.
even just the Declaration of Independence. The stated audience was the kind of opinion of the world, or however Jefferson put it.
Right.
And so, of course, the British are the central international audience. But when they thought about world opinion, they meant enlightened European opinion. That's
Mhm.
they're not thinking too much about what some Mogul in India is thinking about them. They're very much thinking about
Right.
what Condorcet or somebody in Paris is thinking about them.
Right.
So this is an interesting question. We ask everyone sort of this at the end of our towards the end of our conversations, but I'm very curious as to what your answer will be. Um, the reason for this is the stated premise is that for whoever you're listening to this audience, you are probably within an hour drive of something interesting historically. So, given the subject that we've been talking about and the subject of your book, is there any particular sites or museums that would be a good visit for someone who's interested in this history?
That's a great question. Thinking back to one of the things I do, I've done in several summers recently, is taking groups of teachers from Utah, kind of public school teachers. In Utah, U.S. history is taught in 5th, 8th, and 11th grade, so it tends to be those teachers. We do a kind of seminar here and then take them to historic sites. And we've done one connection to the Civil War, but also a couple in relation to the American Revolution. And the American Revolutionary ones, we go to, among the great places we go to, is the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And
Of
you
course.
know, there are museums that clearly have money,
Mhm.
and there are museums that know what to do in terms with like the stuff they've got to create effective um, exhibits. The That museum is both. The stuff
Yeah.
they've got is amazing. That some dude had in his closets in 17 whatever, their great grand nephew gave, because they somehow for some reason trusted this museum. But also just they do a great job of just constructing the kind of interesting and not super simple narratives surrounding the artifacts that they have. And so if you want to kind of get a super interesting view on the kind of complexity that was the American Revolution, you could do way worse than starting with that, the Museum of the American Revolution.
To further plug that museum, and not just because the director or CEO Scott Stevenson's a friend, it's you're totally right in that the energy that is in there in that space is pretty remarkable in how they're
Yeah.
conveying this history. I will say the one thing, and he is self-admitted, if you're going to Google this, if you don't live in Philadelphia or aren't within close to it, and you're going to Google it, take a look at it. What you see, what they have available online does not reflect what the experience is going to the museum.
Right.
Like, so I would say that if you get a chance to, don't go to the YouTube and see like, oh yeah, maybe not. Give it a shot. It's
Yeah.
definitely worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one exhibit, like just one exhibit is super awesome for me. Like I teach about this glorious moment in 1776 when in New York they read the Declaration of Independence and then a mob or crowd,
Mm.
uh, depending on how you want to call them, goes and pulls down the
Group of
equestrian,
insurrectionists.
right,
I
tourists,
don't know.
goes and pulls down the equestrian statue erected in 1770 of George III, and then melts
Mhm.
those into bullets to send their greetings back to George III. They've got like all kind of artifacts from and connected to that gloriously kind of snarky event in American history, and that's just one little exhibit within the broader museum, and you never get that just from like perusing whatever they've got online.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very cool place, and it's a great recommendation.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's okay. I would say go online, visit all of these museums online, but if you can, go
Yes.
to the place, because it's going to be so much more engaging. And you tend to, when I go into museums, there's something you feel about being in the same room as these artifacts or these witnesses that
Right.
you just can't quite get online.
Right. And if you just are online and you don't visit Philly, you won't be able to go to Reading Terminal Market or go get the sausage and pesto pizza at Pietro's Pizzeria. That has to be done in person.
Yeah, that's right. You can't make it as good at home, right?
Yeah.
Listen, this is ending in a great place, and I'm from Philadelphia, but Dr. Mason, that's be why. This is ending in a great spot. I'm very happy with how this interview has the trajectory.
Good. I hope I make you feel better about being an American when I'm talking about Pietro's Pizzeria.
And we
we
want to make sure that people can find you as well. So, I mean, we'll put a link to purchase your book, of course, in our show notes. But do you have any? Are you on any social media? Do you have your own website? What would you like us, visitors or viewers? I'm sorry, or listeners want to come see you, learn more about you? Where should they go?
I appreciate that. I'm a digital immigrant, so I don't have like my own website, and I'm barely on Facebook and Blue Sky. But I am in both of those places, and
okay,
yeah, I'm probably disappointing as a virtual presence.
It's fine. I'm all out on Blue Sky. I just recently got banned for no reason.
Oh,
forget that place. I don't know why. Genuinely, I've complained about this on the last 3 episodes we recorded.
Someone has to be listening.
Because it was a place where I interacted with all the historians, and that's all I did was just like, hey, this new stuff is really cool. Like, that was literally all I did on there, and I cannot access it anymore. Blue Sky help desk, please, people.
Yes,
help.
Listen to
Isaac's. You're done. Blue Sky.
So we'll only give you we'll give you all the other information about Dr. Mason.
And,
no Blue Sky.
I do.
And just to remind the listeners,
the BYU History Department website that tells stuff
we'll send a link to that as well. And to all of your books, because you may have revised some of your information, but your earlier books were just as. I mean, I read your earlier book and I enjoyed it very much. So
I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Read them all.
Yeah. So, and just for the listeners who may need reminding, the name of the book is Seeking the High Ground: Slavery and Political Conflict in the British Atlantic World. And, the link to that, to where to buy that, will be in the show notes.
Yep.
As always, this conversation is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. So if you want early access to these episodes, some behind the scenes content of some fun stuff we're doing over at Primary Source Media, you can go over there and check that out at patreon.com/primary source media. Sometimes we do book giveaways with signed copies of the authors for our Patreon supporters, which is very cool. So go check that out. But thank you so much for being here, Dr. Mason. And thank you for having the scholarly courage to engage with really difficult topics. Absolutely. And in a way that, in revising previous opinions. I think that's always a commendable thing to do.
Yeah, thank you. I mean,
thank you so much.
Slavery, race, and American founding. What could go wrong? There's nothing controversial about it.
No controversy.
But no, I appreciate that. And this has been a really fun conversation. Thank you for having me.